Fried Asian. I'm your host, Keith Chow. On today's show, we're going to be talking with young adult science fiction author Marie Lu. She's the creator of the best-selling Legend series of books, as well as Warcross, The Young Elites, and her new book, Rebel, comes out on October 1st, as well as the graphic novel adaptation of her DC Icons book, Batman Nightwalker. Marie was born in China, but she grew up in Louisiana and Texas, and she's going to talk all about that and becoming an author. So without further ado, here's Marie Lu. Thank you, Marie, for joining us on Southern Fried Asian. I'm very honored to have you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on here.
We met very briefly back at San Diego Comic-Con. You are one of my daughter's favorite authors, and she was so psyched to meet you. She actually rebought a couple of the books that we already had back at home, but she wanted to get you to sign them. So we own multiple copies of Warcross and Legend now.
Oh, please give her all my love. That's so sweet.
Will do. Wanted to talk to you because some people may not know why you're on Southern Fried Asian, is that though you were born in China, you grew up in Texas. And I wanted to talk about your life there. What brought you to Texas? And I heard you had a pit stop on the way to Houston.
Yeah, I did. So I moved with my parents to the States when I was 5 from China. And we originally settled in Baton Rouge and then New Orleans for a couple of years, mostly because my parents got student visas to go to college out there. Mm-hmm. So that's where we settled. And so I spent my first couple of years growing up in New Orleans. And it was, talk about a culture shock. It was like, I remember one of my earliest experiences was Mardi Gras. And because we were like, I was 5 at the time, wow. And my parents didn't speak English. I didn't speak English, and we were just kind of like, let's go see what Americans do on the weekend. So we went out, and it was bonkers. And I was like, what is happening?
America is crazy.
It was interesting. Yeah, it was fun though. I miss it. And then after that, we moved to Houston because my parents got work there.
And so what was life for you like in Houston? Houston, I guess you were a couple years older. Mm-hmm. So how old were you when you finally settled in Texas?
I was 9, I think, when I moved to Texas.
So those are fairly formative years to experience not only culture shock, but, moving and being in a new place. Mm. What was life like as a 9-year-old new to the Houston, Texas area?
At first, it sucked a lot. I had made a lot of friends, in elementary school in New Orleans, and I had loved it there. And I was not happy about moving to Houston. And I remember the first school that we settled in, I got into trouble a lot. I was only there for like 6 months or so, but I had trouble, making friends, and it was rough at first. I guess it would be for any kid that sure. moves during those years. But then my parents moved us to the suburbs, Sugarland. It was it's like this suburban area, and so that was nice growing up. And eventually, I did settle in pretty well in Houston and got used to it.
When you came to the States, you were 5, so that's usually, when you start school. So I guess the trauma of having to switch schools at that young age wasn't as apparent. Like you started, I guess, schooling in America. But did you notice, it's hard when you're in elementary school, right? But like, did you notice being different or anything going to school in Louisiana and then eventually Texas?
It was definitely different from growing up in China. When I was in China, I went to about like a year of school there before I came to the States. And my parents actually had tried to get me into kindergarten a little too young because they needed me to be somewhere during the day.
Right.
And so I remember that I got in trouble all the time because the teachers were like, she doesn't act like she's 5. They're like, oh yeah, she's totally 5. But I was 4. And so I would fall asleep in class and just act up and, get distracted. So it wasn't like I really got the hang of school in China. So I don't know. I was kind of like a naughty kid growing up because I was an only child. I was, part of that only child generation in China. So when I came over to the States, I was still kind of, a little bit spoiled from the way I'd grown up in Asia. And so it was very much a shock of suddenly, back in China, I've been surrounded by relatives all the time. Like I was, one of like 3 kids in our family. So I was very, very spoiled. And then I came over to the States and suddenly it was just me. And my parents who were, working super late, like my dad was working, I think as a janitor part-time while he was studying. And my mom was working at a restaurant as a waitress. And, I was just kind of shuffled in between. And it was very weird to enter that stage. So being in school, it was, I mean, I like at first it was very weird. I had to go to ESL. I didn't know any English. I was trying to learn the language and I would get in trouble all the time in ESL because there was another girl in my class who was actually still one of my very good friends, Julie Zhu. We were like the only two Chinese kids in the ESL class. And so we would just end up sitting in the back talking to each other in Chinese. And so the teacher would separate us into morning and afternoon kindergarten because we just weren't learning anything. So it took a little while, but I think at that age, you kind of adapt quickly, when you're 5. And I think at that age also kids are usually pretty adaptable to each other as well. So the kids were pretty nice to me. I don't think we had a lot of bullying yet. I think we were maybe too small, that vicious bullying age. So so I was able to make quite a few friends there.
I think starting off in kindergarten too, right? You don't have that, you don't notice the differences as much. I mean, like you mentioned, Julie, at least you had the commonality of language, so you don't really necessarily go around going, I'm the only Asian person here. When did that first dawn on you? Or were you ever in a situation where you're like, wow, there's not very many people who look like me?
When I first moved to Houston, the first school that I went to was not very diverse. I think there were maybe like 2 other Asian kids in my school that I remember. And I do remember feeling very much like a fish out of water there. Once I moved to Sugar Land, there are actually quite a lot of Asians, who live in Houston in general. And Houston is, I think it was ranked as the most diverse city in the United States. So so I was lucky enough to get a chance to mingle with kids of, who came from everywhere after that. But you always feel a little bit like a minority in this country if you are a person of color. So it was a little weird in that first school that I moved to in Houston.
A lot of stories of Chinese or Asian American students kind of being the only ones in school always have that lunchbox moment. Is that
oh my God, the lunchbox moments were the worst. They were just I feel like everyone I talk to who's Asian who understands, that moment where you're just like, Mom, I just want the brown bag. I just want like the yucky sandwich with or Lunchables or
Lunchables, exactly.
An apple, or something like that. I don't want, the leftover noodles, and I don't want the fried rice or whatever we had last night. I don't want the fish. I don't want the fish.
Please
in
no
fish. Little plastic.
That's
Please
the
no
worst.
fish. Oh my God. Yeah. And everyone just freaks out because of the smell and tofu. What is that? Oh, I had that conversation so much with my parents, and my mom was just like, I don't understand why it's food.
Yeah,
just
yeah.
take it to school, So yeah, it was a constant battle.
Do you have a traumatic memory? Is there a specific occurrence where you're like, wow, I have PTSD to this day?
Oh, there were multiple moments of sitting. Sometimes you had lunch in a classroom, and I hated that because you just have to sit there with all these other kids. During lunch, I could kind of escape sometimes. You go to the library or whatever. But I remember a couple of times, for whatever reason, we had lunch in classrooms, and then kids next would be like, "What is that? It smells like death, or it smells like poop or whatever." And I'm just like, "Oh my God, this is so embarrassing." Yeah, it was traumatizing, and I still remember that. And now, now that we have a kid, I'm kind of like, do we send him to school with, what should we do? Should we, make sure that he understands that his culture is okay, or do we save him, some random bullying by just giving him the standard brown sack lunch? So I don't know. I don't know what kids do these days.
I know, it's weird. I mean, I feel like I've talked about this with other people in the past, but I feel like maybe today it is a little different because my daughter, for example, where I already mentioned, she'll occasionally, she brings sandwiches, of course, but she'll occasionally bring leftovers from the night before, or she'll bring sushi to lunch, and it's cool. Her friends, what's that? That's awesome, or
that's
not even,
so great.
Not even what's that. It's like, oh, wow, that's sushi. You know what I mean? I wonder if it's just a different time where you
That's
can
crazy.
get away with it more than,
Mhm.
and of course it's the diversity of the school you're in as well. Like if you are going to like a rural all white
Mhm.
school in the middle of nowhere, it might be harder to
Right.
bring stuff like that in. But I don't know. I
Mhm.
think it definitely
Wow.
depends. It's a good thing, right? That's progress.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad for your daughter. This is great to hear. I feel so much better, actually.
Yeah, and by the time your kid gets to school, maybe it'll be even better. Who knows?
Yeah, I hope so. Fingers crossed, right?
Right, unless we fall into a dystopia, which you
Oh,
are
God.
quite familiar with in a lot of your writing.
Yeah. Yeah, we always seem to be falling into one or at some point or other.
Well, speaking of your writing, I wanted to ask, when did you first get that inkling that you wanted to be a writer? Because I know that you actually started off in the video game industry.
Yeah,
Did it start when you were in school? Were you like, did you always want to be creative?
it did. My mom would give me this assignment to go to kindergarten every day and write down 5 English words.
Mm,
And I had to come home and memorize what they meant and put them into sentences and write like a little paragraph. So that was kind of my first exposure really to writing in English at least. And after a while, I kind of like once I picked up English well enough, I realized that I just kind of like that, exercise of putting
right.
paragraphs together. I like telling stories. And, at the time I was like I said, I was being kind of schlepped back and forth. And my parents, if you're a poor immigrant, you don't have childcare like lined up, and it was kind of during that era when you kind of leave your kids,
Sure, yeah.
and people didn't care so much. So I would either be home by myself, or I would go with my mom to the restaurant where she was working, and they would just keep me in like this broom closet.
Yeah, same. I know
Yeah.
exactly the feeling.
Yeah, right. I think they had a TV in there and like a chair, and I just like sat in there like for 8 hours or however long every day, when school wasn't in session, and I would just had all this time on my hands, and so I would just make up stories for myself, for entertainment, and that was kind of how I started realizing that I liked writing stories.
Hmm.
I would write all kinds of little stories for myself and staple them together into books, like write my name on the bottom like I was the author of these books. And I did a lot of that when I was home alone or with, waiting for my mom at the restaurant. And it was just something that I just kept doing as I got older. I didn't really know that you could be a writer like professionally. I didn't
Right.
actually even make the connection that the books that are in the library, like that they were written by people. Like, I don't know where I thought they came from. They were
the
just there.
the book stork, as it were,
The
right?
book, yeah. Yeah, the bookstore. And I didn't realize that until I was in middle school, like I was 13 or something. And I remember the day that I realized that real people wrote books. And that was because I read an article in the Houston Chronicle about this girl named Amelia Atwater Rhodes, who was 13 years old at the time and had gotten her first book deal with Simon and Schuster.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that it was like a lightning bolt. I just remember that moment and thinking like, oh my God, not only are books written by real people, but they can be written by 13-year-old girls.
Were
And
you 13 at the time?
I was 13 at the time,
Mm.
and I just remember thinking, okay, this is something that I want to do. And from that point on, I think I started taking writing a lot more seriously. Not that my writing was very good at 13, but
Sure.
that was when I started making it a goal of mine.
And how did your parents react to that? Because I know a lot of times the stereotype of the Asian parents, the Chinese immigrant parents, is that you can't do something in the creative arts.
Yeah.
Were they supportive, or were they like, "Oh,
No.
that's great. When are you going to go to med school?"
Yeah, that was exactly my entire childhood fell very neatly into like that stereotype. Um, my parents were at first they were kind of amused by it. They were like, oh, this is a strange little thing that she does on the side. Like she also likes to draw and her head's always in the clouds. Like that's just who she is, but she'll grow out of it and she'll, become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, like one of the three choices we have, right?
Right.
So at first they were kind of like whatever about it. But then I think they started realizing how all-consuming this was.
Mm.
Like I would write in class. I would get up in the middle of the night to write. I would like any free time I had, I was just in front of my computer, my old like boxy Apple computer, like just typing, printing out pages. I had papers everywhere, and I think after a while, my parents got a little bit concerned that I was taking this more seriously than I thought that they thought I was going to.
Right. it started eclipsing actual homework, right?
It started eclipse. Like I would have like, I remember I got like a note back from some essay I wrote that said I had too much dialogue in it or something. Like it was like, it was kind of, it was changing the way that I was writing, and it was kind of creeping into like Chinese school and doing my Chinese homework and all of that. And eventually I think I remember I had a conversation with my dad, and he sat me down. He was like, we don't all get to do what we love in life. And I know you love to write, but there's no future in that. And, like make sure you do something that makes it. I remember his comparison actually. He was like, I love to watch movies, but I can't be a movie critic. So I became an engineer instead. And he's like, it's going to be the same for you. And I was like, okay. And I even then at the time, I didn't really, I believed them. I was like, of course how can I be like a professional writer like that? Is that an actual job, that I could do? So I kind of knew, but at the same time I was like, I don't care. I'm still doing it.
Sure.
Just, I just couldn't help myself. So I got in trouble for it a lot as a kid.
There's a running theme, it sounds like, from your childhood, and it's troublemaker, it sounds like.
I was like the most innocent troublemaker. Like I would do those things that weren't like, that you didn't actually get in trouble for. But it was things like, I lied about being at the library. And,
right.
I didn't tell my parents that I would sneak out in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. to write. I would like turn on my little lamp, my desk lamp, and like I would plug the bottom of my door with a bathrobe so they didn't know that I was awake in the middle of the night to write. Like I would do stuff like that a lot.
That's adorable, actually. Like you're sneaking out in the middle of the night to go writing. I hope that's what my daughter does. Because, it's funny, like she's the same age, I think, right now. She's 12. And her goal right now is to be a writer. And she's doing the same thing that you did. Like, where as encouraging as my wife and I are, it does get a little concerning. It's like, you do have homework, honey. Like, let's do the homework first, and then you can spend the rest of the evening, writing in your journal or typing at the computer. But
you guys are doing an amazing job then. You're being, you have to be parents too. I totally get it.
Yeah.
But you're supporting her, and then she knows that it's an okay thing to do. I think that's wonderful. I think she's right on track. Yeah.
Yeah. We haven't had the law school conversation yet, so and I think that's also a difference with generations, right? Like especially when you're the child of immigrants who are struggling, and they have to, there's a reason why they set these expectations for you that you don't necessarily understand.
Yeah, and it's something that I don't think I really understood until I had my own kid, and my mom started telling me more stories about when she was growing up. And I don't know if it's like that for other immigrant families, but I feel like a lot of our parents came from situations that were just so far removed from anything that I could even to talk to them about, these kinds of things. Like I just want to be creative. I just want to do my thing. But for them, it was like, no, it's about survival.
Sure.
And, my mom, they grew up during the Cultural Revolution in China. It was like a dark, dark time. And, she had seen people die like every day in her village. And she was like, I witnessed some horrible things. I can never tell you about it. I almost starved to death. But I'm sorry that you want to become a writer and that you, don't want to become a lawyer. I'm so sorry. I have no idea what you're talking about,
right.
So I get where they're coming from too. It's like you said, like it's a different generation.
Well, and I think, a lot of people in our generation kind of side-eye that whole tiger mom or that stereotype that we talked about, but it does come from somewhere, right? Like there's an understanding about why do Asian parents typically, and not all, right? Like I don't want to paint a broad brush, and that's the thing about stereotypes.
Sure.
Make this assumption that everyone is the same when there are examples of supportive Asian parents.
Absolutely.
But we also have to have that understanding of like, where does it come from? And especially you think about immigrants, especially communities that aren't necessarily, large communities. Like when you do grow up in the South or grow up in like a small town where there aren't other Asian people, or that like there aren't a lot of uncles and aunties, right? Like you just kind of have to struggle, survive on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you were 13 years old. You knew you wanted to be a writer. At what point did you finally decide, like, this is exactly, like, your dad sat you down, you had the conversation about engineering, but when did you finally decide, you know what, I'm going to be a writer and focus that entirely?
It was around that age. Yeah, when I was 14, I told myself that I was going to write a novel and get it published. And I remember going to the library. I mean, we had the internet at this point, but not like a ton of information on it.
Sure.
And I just remember going to the library and checking out like a giant stack of like how to write a book, books, and how to, what are the steps to getting published. And I like looked up agents, and I was sending out like,
Oh, wow.
back then, like snail mail letters, real letters to query agents. And I wrote my
So
first.
when you were a teenager, you knew
Yeah,
you needed a literary agent. That's amazing.
I knew. I mean, it was one of those things where like if you get obsessed about something, you just start like that's all you ever read. That was like kind of my all-consuming thing at the time, and that's why my parents were kind of like, I think she's a little overly serious about this.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I was really, really, really into it. I read all the science fiction and fantasy I could get my hands on. I remember looking up like a local writers group in Sugar Land, and I went to like one meeting and never went back because I was so out of place,
Right.
like not even just, the only person of color in the group, but like being just this teenage girl. Everyone else was, in their late 40s and up, and I just was like, this is not right for me. And I just kind of like, I had trouble finding, that community when I was at that age. I just didn't really know if there were other people like that, who wanted to be writers at my age. And so I just was kind of feeling around in the dark for a while. But yeah, I read a bunch of books on, with the steps, and looked at all these agents and sent them like, I'm sure, in horribly embarrassing query letters about my first novel, which was also horribly embarrassing. It was like a fantasy novel that was a total ripoff of Lord of the Rings. Yeah, and of course I got back like 100 rejection letters, and so yeah, that was when I started. I wrote a couple of manuscripts in high school that were all very terrible, and tried to get them all published.
Do you still have any of them?
I don't. I think I have. I do have all of them. Yeah, I was about to say I don't have the first one, but I think I do have an old copy of it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's I try not to look back at them too much because I read them, I'm like, oh God.
Well, what was the journey like from that first terrible manuscript to Legend then?
Mhm.
How did that, I don't know what the
Yeah.
time gap between that and Legend is. I'm sure it's several years, but what was
Mhm.
the journey from that first manuscript to Legend like for you?
Yeah, it was 12 years from that first manuscript to when I started writing Legend. And what happened was I wrote a second manuscript after I got like 100 rejection letters for the first one. I think I was in my senior year at this point in high school. And I did manage to get an agent with the second manuscript.
Mm.
And he started sending it out to editors. And I remember thinking at that point, I was like, oh my God, this is it. Once you get an agent, you're going to get published, and like it's going to be so easy. And oh my God, I'm so excited. But, nobody bit because the manuscript just wasn't good enough. And actually that book starred the same main character as one of my main characters in Legend. It was my character Day.
Oh.
So yeah, he had been in a very, very early story of mine. But the rest of the story he was like the only good thing about that story. Like nothing else about it was good. So, my agent had tried and failed to sell it. And during that time, I went off to college. I moved to LA to go to USC, and I was majoring in biology and in political science because, doctor, lawyer. So, and on the side,
The
I'm
dutiful
just
Chinese daughter you were.
the dutiful Chinese. Yeah, I got to do my duty. But on the side, I was still, trying and failing to write. And I wrote like a third manuscript, and I gave it to my agent, and my agent just hated it. He thought it was awful. And it was awful. I went back and read parts of it. I was like, yeah, I can see why he didn't like it. And so, the second one didn't sell. The third one he hated. So we parted ways
Okay.
after that. And that was when I felt really down about my writing, because I was like, you got that first taste of like, oh, potential success. And
Sure.
then now I had taken a step back. And I felt like I had just gone right back to square one. I had no manuscript, I had no agent. And I remember thinking to myself around then, because, I was getting close. I was like a junior or something. I was getting close to graduating, and I had applied for law school and everything. And I was just like, you know what? Maybe this is not in the cards for me. Maybe I'm just not good enough to be a writer. I shouldn't be doing this. And I had this weird idea also that I was like, maybe it's time that I grew up. Like I thought that maybe this was a thing that kids dream about,
Right.
and that now it was
childish pursuits, right?
Yeah, exactly. Childish pursuits, and it's not really realistic, and it's just like drawing and playing video games and all of that, like reading fantasy novels. Like I was like, my parents don't read fantasy novels. Most adults don't. No, don't read. So I just didn't think that it was a thing that I could keep doing. So I stopped writing for a few years. I just stopped for I think 2 years.
Just like cold turkey, you didn't write.
Just cold turkey, yeah. I think I ran out of creative juice, and I was kind of exhausted from rejections.
Sure.
I think I accumulated probably like 500 or 600 rejection letters at that point.
Jeez.
So
wow.
that was a lot. I had like a big stack of rejection letters because I had tried sending out that third manuscript again to other agents and nobody bit. So yeah, I stopped for a while. And then when I was ready to graduate, I had gotten into a law school. I was about to go, but I was just not like, I was just feeling, that classic, like, what do I do with my life? Like, this is what I want. And I remember wandering around campus during one of the last days of university and just feeling sorry for myself. And then I saw this bulletin on a kiosk on campus, and I stopped. And the bulletin said, it was from Disney Interactive Studios. And it said, do you like to play video games? And I've always liked to play games. It was kind of one of those things in addition to writing and drawing and reading that I love to do. I played video games a lot. And I remember my parents had to confiscate my video games when I was like 8 or something, because I guess I just get obsessive about things. So I stopped and I saw that and I read the rest of it. And it was like, well, do you like to draw? And if you do, then we are looking for 8 interns to join us for 6 months at Disney Interactive Studios to be a think tank and to work on thinking up new video game ideas for Disney.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I saw that and I was like, oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know that video games was a job that you could have either. It was
until you saw this 13-year-old girl.
Yeah, exactly. This was my 13-year-old girl moment where I had that moment. I was like, oh, you can do this as a job too. Like you can make money working. I mean, of course, video games come from somewhere, right? And I just didn't think about that either. So I remember going back to my dorm and looking up the internship and cobbling together like a portfolio of art that I had done, when I was younger. And I submitted it, and then I ended up getting into the internship. And that's how I ended up in video games. It was just a very like serendipitous. Yeah, exactly. And I still remember calling my mom about it. I was like, Mom, can I turn down law school and I'm going to go work in video games for 6 months with no promise of a future career. Like, who knows what to do after that? And my mom was like, okay.
Well, at least she said okay.
Yeah, I think at that point she was kind of like, you know what? You're 22. Yeah. What am I going to like? Go, if this is what you want to do, go do your thing. And she's like, I'm sure she thought like she's going to end up in our basement like in about a year. So, yeah, that's how I ended up in video games. And from there, I was working in games. I loved it so much. And on the side, I was still writing. And I credit video games for getting me back into writing because, I had stopped for a while. But this was my first time working in a creative industry.
And activated that creativity again.
Exactly. And this was my first time, being around other people who were adults, but also doing creative things. They were telling stories and they were making games and drawing and writing. And I was just like, oh, it's okay to do these things as an adult. Like, this was not a childish pursuit that I had. And it was okay that I loved, fantasy and science fiction and writing and all of these things. So I started writing again. And I wrote a 4th manuscript and I sent that out. I got an agent and she sent it out and nobody took it either. But that was when I was like, you know what, this is fine. Like I built up like a pretty hard shell at this point to rejection. And I was so used to it that it didn't really bother me as much as it used to. And so while I was waiting on rejections for that, I started writing Legend. I know that's a really long-winded answer to get to this point.
Well, not at all. It's a long, winding road, right?
Yeah.
I guess. But that's also, I think that's the key is like the moment where you're like, you know what, it doesn't matter is when it usually happens, right? Like when you're so kind of caught up in like trying to please people. Am I going to be good? Am I going to be accepted? It's kind of like when you have, 0 F's to give is when usually things start going your way.
Yeah. It's funny how that works out.
It's interesting too that the internship you took, it was like such an environment to create because like, as you said, you're just kind of spitballing ideas. You're just coming up with ideas, it sounds like. And it's just the perfect environment to.
It was, and I think back and I'm like, I feel like it would have been very different if it had been any other kind of internship, even at Disney, because, Disney is a creative company, but it's also a huge corporation that's also very not creative behind the scenes. But this specific internship was incredibly creative. They just basically just put us in a room and were like, come up with games. They're like,
Right, yeah.
every week we're going to meet and we're going to hear about the new games that you came up with, and we like an idea. You get to concept it out, and
Yeah, that sounds
and
amazing. That sounds
it
amazing,
was
like right now.
amazing. Yeah, I know. Like if I could do that, I would go back and, do that again. It was so fun. And the eight of us became really good friends. And, like my husband is one of the interns from that internship.
Oh, wow,
So
cool.
everything worked out really well.
Where did your love of science fiction and fantasy come from? Is that what you would always been gravitated towards since you were little?
Now that I'm having this conversation with you, I think it's really funny that I have a lot of these like moments in my life where I remember exactly when I became a fan of something.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, for me, I always loved reading. I had a lot of, like I said, I had a lot of time on my hands, as an only child with,
Yeah.
Just staying at home all day. So I remember just reading a ton of horse novels. Like I read a lot of the Black Beauty novels, the Black Stallion, and Margaret Henry books, and that kind of stuff. I loved animal books as a kid, and I didn't really discover fantasy and science fiction yet until I think I was 11. I was 11, and I was in middle school, and I was walking past the library display at my school library, which is why I think libraries are just this miracle, this country and around the world. I was walking past the library and I just saw this little display, and they had a book called Madame Mayo by Brian Jakes. And it's a fantasy series starring like mice and little woodland creatures and stuff. Mm-hmm. But on the cover, there was like a picture of a mouse warrior. This little mouse dressed in a robe and with a giant sword. And I was just like, this looks ridiculous. And I didn't think much of it. I walked past it, and then I walked back. I just kept walking past it like all week, and I just kept looking at that cover, and I was like, this is so weird. What is this? What a weird looking book. And finally I gave in, and I went, and I was like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to read it. And I read it, and I just loved it. It was like finding yourself,
Mm-hmm.
And I went back. I don't remember how long it took me to read that book. It couldn't have been more than a couple of days. And I just went back and just checked out everything in that series. It was the Red Wall series by Brian Jakes, and I just devoured all of them. And that was my entry point to my gateway drug to science fiction and fantasy. And from there, I just read pretty much all the fantasy and science fiction I could find, and just loved all of it. I was so obsessed with it. Yeah, that book changed my life.
And then all your manuscripts, because it sounded like this predated the obsessive writing stage. Was
Yes.
all of your writing science fiction / fantasy?
My writing at that
you had that
point,
Lord of the Rings, ripoff, but then
yeah. Yeah, accurate, because, in middle school, after I read that book, all of my writing was fan fiction for Redwall. I wrote a ton of fan fiction for it. Later on became Harry Potter. Harry Potter started coming around the same time, and I read that, obsessed over it, wrote Harry Potter fan fiction. And so, yeah, I think that's why my first book was very similar to Lord of the Rings.
Now that you're best known for being a science fiction / fantasy writer, specifically the YA genre, what compelled you to want to be a YA author?
It's funny. I didn't know that YA was an actual specific category when I first started writing legend. And I looking back, I think a lot of my early manuscripts, I didn't make it all fit into YA, and I just know it. When I was growing up, we didn't have the specific category of YA, but I think because I was reading a lot of fantasy and science fiction, at the time, a lot of fantasy starred teenagers.
Right.
They were technically adult books, but the protagonists were like 16, 17, and so I think I just grew up with that in my head, and I was around that age too, so I think I just naturally associated fantasy and science fiction with young protagonists. So that's what I wrote. And I remember when I first wrote Legend, I gave it to my agent, and I had pitched it as like adult science fiction. And my agent was the one who wrote back to me and said, this fits very neatly into YA. And I was like, what's YA? And she's like, it's Twilight, it's the Hunger Games. I was like, oh, okay, well, great. let's submit it as that. So that was kind of how I fell into it. It was very by accident. Like I had read the Hunger Games and I read Twilight, and that was all that I had read from YA.
Right.
But now, once I entered YA, I just couldn't stop reading YA. I just love the category. Yeah. It just, I could see why my voice just kind of slotted very neatly into it.
Well, you say you submitted Legend as an adult sci-fi. Did you have to de-age the characters, or were they always teenagers even when you submitted that quote-unquote adult manuscript?
They were always teenagers.
What was the difference in your mind that made it adult versus YA?
I mean, I had written a YA book. I just thought it was adult
Oh,
because cause
I
like
see what you mean.
because when I had been reading fantasy and science fiction, I read a lot of like, Piers Anthony and Terry Brooks and
Hmm.
David Eddings and those types of authors, and all of their protagonists were teenagers. And I feel like if they went back and recategorized those books, I feel like a lot of them would be young adult books.
Right.
So I think that's why I just thought I had written, an adult fantasy book
Sure.
or adult science fiction book. And Chris is like, no, there's a new category for it now. It's YA. And I was like, great. I'm glad to find, an actual category for myself.
Yeah. One of the things that I notice about books like the Legend series and the Warcross books is that the protagonists are all characters of color.
Hmm.
Is that intentional?
Yes, very intentional. Because the first manuscripts that I wrote were all white characters.
Hmm.
Like I didn't know because all of fantasy and science fiction, almost all of it was very, very white
Right.
at the time. And I was a teenager. I didn't know any better. I was just like, oh, this is just how it is.
Right. It's a
And
default.
it's a default. Exactly. And so I will follow the default. And, this is the hallmark of these types of books. So that's what I'm going to write.
Hmm.
So all of my early books were, starring 100% white characters. I just didn't know any better. And then when I got a little bit older, I think the first book that I read with even a female protagonist was Jacqueline Carey's Kushil's Dart series.
Hmm.
And that was the first time I saw a female lead in a fantasy series. And that I think was kind of my slow awakening. And also, the fact that I was in college, and in college you get exposed to so many different
Sure.
people, so many different ideas. And that was when I started seeing just this huge hole in my favorite, genre to read. And I was like, where am I? Where is everyone else that I see around me? Where are Black people? Where are brown people? Where are, Asian people? Where are we in these books that I loved? And yeah, at that point, I think I started trying to make a more conscious decision to write people of color into my stories. And even then, and this is a really sad and embarrassing thing to admit, even then I just knew that, if I write this, I will have a harder time getting published.
Hmm.
So early on, I think I tried to make it a more subtle thing in my books. I felt like it was dangerous to be labeled as an Asian American
Sure.
author because, you just get stuck being the Asian American author and you're always going to end up like on a diversity panel or whatever.
Right. Or in the
And that's all you're going
niche
to do.
shelf in the bookstore. Right.
Exactly. And like the cultural section or whatever, instead of like the science fiction and fantasy section. And I didn't want that. So I remember at the time, this was before the entire, industry started shifting.
Hmm.
I just remember thinking like, I need to be careful how I create my career. And that if I want to write something that feels very, Asian, I need to wait a few years and establish myself before I can actually do that. So I think I remember being just very cautious about it early on.
Hmm.
Tried to put it in where I could, but it was a very wary move on my part.
But even in Legend, the character of Day
Mhm.
is mixed race Asian.
Yes.
I guess was
yeah.
it just through like just physical description? And because that's the one thing I always found fascinating about your career is that as popular as your books have become, they were never, pardon the phrase, pigeonholed as Asian American
Mhm.
novels, right?
Yeah.
But they clearly were, especially like when Warcross came out and the lead character is Emika Chen. It's like, wow, that's
Right.
the most
Yeah.
Asian name ever. But
It
like,
is very Asian.
but you know what I mean? Like, but it was still like you said, in Barnes Noble, it was still in the front of the store, right? Not in the back. How did you kind of like, thread that needle?
Yeah, I just couldn't help myself. I felt compelled to put some piece of myself in these stories. And I realized that as I wrote, there were just parts of being Asian and Asian culture that just popped. It was just who I am.
Mhm.
I think that it's impossible to completely erase yourself from your writing. And I tried to,
Right.
keep it as, safe, quote, quote, as I could. But I go back and I read Legend. I'm like, look, there's the street food that they're selling, on the streets of futuristic Los Angeles. There are things like, fried dough,
Mhm.
and eggs and things on a stick, meat on a stick. Like these are like Asian street foods,
Right.
like white was the symbol of death.
Right.
And June, when she goes to her brother's funeral, she's wearing white. Like these are like Asian things, and I was just putting them in. Like that was the culture that I knew. And so it was always creeping in, even as I was kind of holding it back a little bit. I couldn't not put a piece of myself on the page. And by the time I got to Warcross, I think that was the book where I was like, you know what? I feel brave enough now with enough books out that I am going to just be unapologetically, Asian about my main character. And yeah, that was the journey to it.
What I think as you mentioned, the industry kind of shifted in between, like when you think of like the diverse books kind of movement as the bifurcation. Like before that, people were either unaware or, actively kind of, as you said, masking quote unquote ethnicity or, trying to be neutral and not realizing the choice to be neutral isn't in itself, a very specific choice of identity. Right. And then in the post-diverse books kind of movement where it's like it's celebrating authors of color, characters of color, stories of color, and also noticing that like the more this is now it's become cliche, but the more specific that you make a story, the more universal it becomes, right? Like that kind of delusion that we've told ourselves that only white is neutral is that's a myth that's being shattered now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it was, everybody can stand on the back of the people who came before them. Like for me, at the time that I was first starting out, there were authors like Melinda Lowe and Cindy Pon, and they were kind of some of the front runners of writing unapologetically, Asian-inspired fantasy and science fiction. And if it wasn't for them, I don't think I would have been able to break out. I think that it was very much a path that they were carving, for me, and then, for authors that came afterwards. It's one step at a time in this industry, and lately it's kind of been a like we've been saying, it's been more of like a movement, and it's been really encouraging to see that pace speed up. And even then, it's frustrating because it doesn't feel fast enough.
Right.
You feel like sometimes people are doing it because it's the cool thing to do. And I talk about this all the time with other, writers of color. Like I'm afraid of it being a trend, like the vampire trend, and you got the dystopian trend, and now we've got the diversity trend. And, there'll be a day when people get tired of that and we have to go back to being careful. And I don't want to see that, so I hope the movement continues to gather steam.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And you do see like backlash, and it's important to kind of like push back against the backlash, backlash against the backlash sometimes, because a lot of those forces do want it to go, it's that whole make publishing great again kind of mentality.
Oh God, yeah, I know. It's change is uncomfortable for people, especially people who are comfortable in the status quo. So
right, and a lot of your stories do take place in a dystopian kind of post-apocalyptic world, and it does, and it's always fascinating that you would think in the future, like you mentioned the environment of a book like the Legend series, where it is very inspired by just diverse cultures. You would think the future should be more diverse than because that's right. You look at like something like Star Trek, where everything, it's the melding of all these people. But then you do read a lot of science fiction dystopian, and like everybody's white, and you're just like, how is that possible?
I'm like, really? I remember when I was and specifically like cyberpunk really gets on my nerves, because cyberpunk is quintessentially Asian. It has always been, right? Like every single cyberpunk out there is like some random Asian city full of white people, and I'm like, what? Why? I don't understand. Like it doesn't actually make good world building sense.
Right.
And I think that's always been the problem with white centric science fiction. It just doesn't make sense. Like as a science fiction and fantasy writer, one of the hallmarks is world building, and it's just bad storytelling. Because this is not the future. It's not the present. So it's people who are not doing their homework.
There's always this idea that like they'll create aliens or they'll create fantastical species, but then the idea of like a black person in Middle Earth is like, oh my God, that's impossible.
God forbid. I know. Then there's like a petition online or something. I'm like, oh God, here we go.
I know you probably can't talk a lot about, but if and when your books ever get adapted to other media, how important is it to you that they retain the authenticity in casting. Again, I know that this may be sensitive because there's a lot of, I'm sure, negotiations going on and everything, but like you see this all the time. You know, you mentioned Cyberpunk and Ghost in the Shell casting Scarlett Johansson, for example, right? Like this idea that, well, if we're going to make a legend movie, we're going to have to cast, whatever white actress and actor are popular at the time.
Yeah, it's very, very important to me because I know how hard it hits when I see Asian characters that are erased from, stories that I know. So it is important to me that those characters stay true to who they are ethnically. And it's a hard thing to stick to, especially with a series like Warcross, specific, just because Emika is so blatantly Asian and Hideo is so blatantly, everything about it is so blatantly Asian. I feel like I remember when I was writing at the time, I was like, putting this in, this will hurt its chances of becoming any kind of film or TV series. And I remember having a talk with my husband too at the time, my husband who's Filipino, and he was like, you can't make this you can't make the male lead Asian. Like you're never going to get a Hollywood studio to agree to a male Asian romantic lead. It's just not going to happen. And he's saying this as an Asian man, right. As a very hot Asian man. And I just remember feeling so sad about that. And that this was the kind of thing that you had to do. You had to make these, like he was like, cast a white person, you'll get a better chance of making it. And he was genuinely excited. He was serious about it. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, this is the story that it wants to be, and I have to keep it this way. And at the time, I remember feeling pretty bummed about it because I was like, I'm going to write it this way, and I know that it's going to hurt its chances, and it has hurt its chances. This was like pre, Crazy Rich Asians, and yeah, it was like there were other reasons behind why people weren't jumping on Warcross at the time, but one of the reasons I think was because of the very blatant Asian cast and.
Right, and it's like everyone's Asian. It's set in Tokyo. It's like there's
it's set all the main characters are Asian, and it just wasn't going to happen. So
but
it was
in a post Crazy Rich Asians world, though. Like I feel like we, and it's not just Crazy Rich Asians. This we kind of do live in a post whitewashing, at least post calling out whitewashing, right? Because there was a period where. Let's say they did adapt Warcross and but we're going to cast Jennifer Lawrence or whatever, you know what I mean? But, But Jennifer Lawrence as Emika Chen, which was actually possible in 2016,
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like we laugh, but they do that all the time. I'm like, come on, Josh, Scarlett Johansson, really? Right. And it's just more insulting because they keep the Asian names.
Exactly.
Yeah,
she looks just like Motoko Kusanagi, right?
Yeah. I'm like, oh, dead ringer. So. Yeah.
But do you feel like more optimism now that, there are actual, now there are A-list actors who are Asian American or Asian and that can greenlight them? Because that used to always be the excuse, right? Well, you can't cast an Asian actress because Scarlett Johansson has the box office clout. But now you have Constance Wu, Awkwafina, Henry Golding, the entire Crazy Rich Asians cast now that can greenlight a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And movies like To All the Boys, that before, like Jenny Han's kind of broken huge barriers for Asian casting in films. So yes, I think the environment is totally different now. And I can't talk a lot about Warcross, but there are a lot more players, I think, in Hollywood who are starting to realize that you can cast Asians in you can cast people of color in stories and have them be leads and make a ton of money. Yeah. It's okay. Like, we also have money and we go see movies, and white people will also watch movies with, people of color. Like, you can do this, and it's a viable business, So it's been nice to see that happening in Hollywood. And I think there have always been some players in Hollywood who are more progressive than others and willing to take these chances, but it's hard. It's making movies costs so much money. And I know it's a fight to get anyone to spend that much money on and take a chance, but they also take chances on movies full of cats. So come on, surely it can't be that big of a leap, right? To cast, people of color.
Yeah. And the other frustration is that they use that excuse, but then if you look at Ghost in the Shell or The Great Wall, like these movies where they have to whitewash because of financing, they all bomb. So it's not
exactly.
What are you saving by, putting a white person in the lead?
Yeah, like, you're losing money. You might as well just, lose diversely. Give it a shot, you know?
Give it a shot, exactly.
Yeah.
Before we get to the new book, I did want to mention, just as a hardcore Batman fan, the fact that you got to write a DC Icons book about Bruce Wayne. First of all, were you a fan of, you mentioned science fiction and fantasy, but were you a fan of superheroes growing up as well?
I was. I mean, I wasn't obsessed with it in the same way, but I was a big fan of Batman the animated series growing up as a kid. Like that was my first exposure to superheroes.
Yeah,
and I
that's a great entry into superheroes.
Yeah, yeah. I loved everything about it. It was so dark and serious, and I just loved Batman. I loved Robin. I loved like the Teen Titans. I was really into that as a kid. And I never thought, again, I feel like my life is just full of serendipity. Like I just didn't think I would ever be someone who contributed anything to Batman canon, but the opportunity came to me, and I just remember the email from my agent. They're like, DC's putting together this line called DC Icons, and do you want to write a superhero? And I was like, yes. Yes. What kind of question is that? So yeah.
And then did you get your pick, or did they come to you with Bruce Wayne?
I did get my pick. I was very lucky. I was one of the first to get to choose, and they had 4 starting out. So they had Wonder Woman and Batman and Catwoman and Superman, and they were like, "Which one of the 4 would you like?" And I was like, "I would like Batman, please." It was just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it was a great book. Just the idea of being able to write any kind of Batman, even a pre-Batman story. Like
yeah.
But yeah, I did want to talk briefly about the new book that you have coming out this fall, Rebel. For anyone who's read the Legends series, it kind of wrapped up pretty definitively in the 3rd book. How does Rebel kind of contribute to the story that seemed finished?
Yeah. It was Champion had to me a satisfying but open ending. So at the end, it's an ending of possibility. So you don't really know what's going to happen to Day and June and my other characters, at the end. But I felt like it ended on a very optimistic note. And I was okay with that ending at the time. And it felt like closure. And after a while, I realized that I wasn't quite over the characters. I would write these little scenes for myself of like, what if, in the future. And I wrote like a little, like a what if alternate epilogue of Champion, but from Day's point of view. The original one ended in June's point of view. And I also got tons and tons and tons of emails, like steadily. It's easily my most asked question is what happens to, Day and June and everyone after the end of Champion. And for a long time, I wasn't ready to answer that. And I didn't know if I would ever answer it. And then eventually I just realized that I wanted closure for these characters too. Like I wanted definitively to know exactly what happens to them after the end of Champion. And I felt like there was one more book left that I could write in this world. And now, I feel like I'm jinxing myself, but now I definitely feel like I am at the end of this story with these characters in this world. And I think a huge part of it was the climate that we're in, the very sucky climate that we're in. I feel like Champion had ended, before Trump took power, and I was okay with this open ending. And now, with like our future so uncertain, I felt like I needed to find closure in something that I could control.
Right.
I was like, I don't know how much I can do for the world that we're in. Like we try our best. We're all doing our best. I don't know how much power I have. But in this world, I am God and I can make this thing happen. So I wanted to do it for myself. I wanted to do it for a lot of my readers. And I'm like, I just want to make you happy. So I'm going to give you an ending and to answer all of those emails that I've been getting over the years.
So basically this is just a response to all the emails in a way, right?
It's kind of a response to all of the emails, and it's a response to, my own lingering questions. And yeah, it's closure, I think, for me and hopefully for my readers.
Well, and I that's a very interesting parallel that you've drawn in the sense that, your story is a dystopian fiction where the country is split in two, and in a way it does feel like 2016 sense is quite dystopian now. Like it may not be officially split in two, but it does feel like we're heading in that direction. So it does give you an opportunity to at least shine some optimism in the world.
I hope so. Yeah, it was kind of my way of getting through, mentally through these
Right.
times. So
Yeah.
I hope it helps for others.
Well, I think I speak for everyone who's listening that we are very excited. Before we end, I did want to, there's this recurring segment that we have on the podcast where we talk about food because, as you know,
Of course.
as an Asian, as a Southerner,
Mm-hmm.
there's one thing that unites us all.
Yep.
Is an
I
inordinate
love
love
it.
of food. So
Mm-hmm.
is there a particular dish or food or memory that you have, or flavor, smell, taste that sends
Mm-hmm.
you back to, whether it's Sugarland or New Orleans or whatever, that brings you
Mm-hmm.
back home? What would it be?
Sure. I have two. One is specifically Asian and the other is from New Orleans.
Okay.
For the Asian food, it's dumplings. My mom's side of the family is northern. They were from Beijing, and my mom is very good at making dumplings.
Okay.
Just all kinds of dumplings. Like she rolls out the wrappers herself, and
Yeah.
it's all like made from scratch. And I just have all these memories from when I was younger and helping her doing that, like learning how to fold the dumpling correctly and making them for Chinese New Year and that kind of thing. So I just love dumplings. Like that is my absolute favorite Chinese food. I could have it for like weeks and weeks. I'm sure my husband's like, can we not have dumplings tonight? And I'm like, no, we're going to have it again. So I love it. It always reminds me of my mom. It reminds me of growing up.
Yeah.
So that's my Asian food. My Southern food is Cajun food. Like
Okay.
I adore spicy food. I love Cajun food. I loved many things about New Orleans. I love the people there. I love, I had so many friends there, and I loved the food.
Yeah.
Like the Cajun, like I just have this memory of the first time my parents took us to this Cajun restaurant. I forgot the name of it, but it was one of those places with a bench, and you just take a bucket of like crawfish and corn and sausage, and you just dump it on the table and you're just eating it. And I'm a little bit allergic to some of the spices in it, so I would get this rash around in my mouth, and I was like, I don't care, I'm gonna keep eating. So I just like every time I would get this rash, I'm like, it hurts so good, I don't care, I'm gonna keep going. So I just absolutely love that about growing up in New Orleans.
How often do you get to eat Cajun food?
Now, very rarely. I haven't had a lot of chances to go back to New Orleans, so I miss it. I would need to do like a proper trip back.
Well, that's what book tours are for, right?
Exactly. I know. Someone send me to New Orleans, please.
Well, Marie, thank you so much for taking time out to talk with us. We could probably talk for a few more hours, but I know that you have a busy day and we need to get back at it. But before we go, can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you on the internet? Sure.
I'm usually on Instagram at Marie Liu the writer, and sometimes I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter a little bit less these days, but I'm Marie_Liu on Twitter. Yeah, and that's where you can find me online. And thank you again so much for this conversation, Keith. It was so fun. Yeah, I'm sure we'll bump into each other again and chat some more. But this was great. Thank you.
Thank you. I had such a great time.
Thanks.
Thanks once again to Marie Liu for joining us on the podcast. As always, the podcast is produced by Jess Vu. Follow Southern Fried Asians on Twitter at Southern Asians and on Instagram at Southern Fried Asians. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find out about this and other podcasts in the Hard Knock Network. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere you get podcasts. Give us a rating and review if you do. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.